For those of you who are first starting, welcome. We have a lot of interesting speakers yet to finish out the day, but we're finishing up this morning with Dr. Asif Siddiqi, who is a professor at Fordham University in New York, where he teaches on the history of science and technology. He is the author of many books on the history of space exploration, including Challenge to Apollo, the Soviet Union and the Space Race from 1945 to 1974, and Red Rockets Glare, Spaceflight, and the Russian Imagination from 1857 to 1957. So without further ado, welcome Dr. Asif Siddiqi.
Okay, so I hope you guys can hear me. Let me know if there's a problem with the sound. Glenn, am I coming in okay?
Yep, you're coming in fine.
Okay, so first of all, thank you all for coming to the session, and thank you to Glenn and Dina for inviting me to be part of this really amazing event. I'll get to my talk very quickly. The talk is essentially a kind of compilation of information and materials that I've collected over the years. As Glenn mentioned, I wrote a book called Challenge to Apollo, the Soviet Union and the Space Race, which came out over 20 years ago now. And but since then, a lot of interesting information has come out. Not that much has principally changed in our interpretation of the Soviet moon program, but nevertheless, there's some interesting things that I think people might be interested in. The talk today is really about the programmatic and technological aspects of the Soviet moon project, rather than, let's say, social, cultural, or other aspects, which are also quite interesting. But I will start off with a couple of slides which allow us to imagine what the Soviets were thinking about the moon in the 1950s. These are magazine covers, mostly geared towards youth in the 1950s, which suggests that they're already thinking about, or there's a generation coming up that are thinking about going to the moon and what might happen there and things like that. And this particular article, which was the title translated as "How the Moon Will Be Conquered" from 1957, tells us, also imagines all the different ways in which surface exploration might be imagined. So as most of you probably know, in the 1960s, the Soviet Union was quite active in space exploration. And then there were some key moments, which most of you, I'm sure, know. Sputnik in 1957, first person in space in 1961. Yuri Gagarin, of course, the first person to walk in space, Leonov. And also, not so much maybe remembered to this day, but the first robot to land on the moon and take pictures of the surface, Lunar 9 in 1966. You also have but then the pivot, the pivot of the space race shifts towards the United States, and of course Apollo 8 and then Apollo 11 takes up the baton, and that's the conclusion of the race. So my question, and many others have posed this question, is what happened between, let's say, 1966 and 69 to shift, pivot this priority they had in the early 60s. One of the key figures, of course, of the Soviet program was Sergei Pavlovich Korolev, who I'm sure many of you have heard of. He was the engineering chief of the Soviet space program. They had this formal title, chief designer. And he was an ambitious aeronautics engineer who had survived Stalin's Gulag. He headed the Soviet ballistic missile program after World War II. And but also he had, from his younger days, formed a kind of coalition of like-minded space enthusiasts who were now in positions of power in the 60s. But they all, as again, some of you might know, they didn't really get along by the 1960s. And there's three men really, they figure quite prominently in this story. There's, of course, Korolev, who heads a very, very large design organization with about 10 to 15,000 people who work in various facilities, building spacecraft, missiles, rockets, etc. There's his compatriot Valentin Glushko, who is the designer of rocket engines, who he collaborates with quite a bit in the post-war era, but has a huge falling out in the 1960s. And then there's Vladimir Chelomey, who's sort of a newcomer to missiles in space, who employs the son of Nikita Khrushchev, Sergei Khrushchev, and thus has access directly to the top. So they're all sort of jockeying for positions of influence in the early 1960s, and their relationship, both personal and professional, has a deep impact on how things really play out in the 1960s. And I should mention Korolev and Glushko on the left, where their relationship had absolutely sort of splintered by about 1959, 1960 over technical issues, but their personal relationship also, they couldn't even stand to be in the same room. And there's all sorts of stories about their personal acrimony between them. So that just based on that, there's an understanding that the space program is driven by conflict. But there's also other types of conflict that's sort of going on. There's a conflict between the civilian and military goals of the space program. The same organizations actually built both what we might consider strategic missiles, but also spacecraft. There's also the issue of government priority. The 1960s, the Soviet government's priority was essentially attaining strategic parity with the United States. And so, which meant a ton of ICBMs, basically, an enormous amount, basically, and which was very expensive. And since the same design organizations were building the ICBMs, they were their efforts were siphoned off, and they needed much more money for this. So there's a kind of a tension about what do you want to do with all this money? Do you want to build ICBMs, or do you want to have more space spectaculars? I mentioned the conflict between chief designers. The principal one was, of course, between Korolev and Glushko. Very rarely do we see them in the same picture. Here, Korolev on the left, smiling with his cosmonauts Alexei Leonov there, but Glushko on the right, impassive, perhaps unhappy to be there. So how does this all sort of start? How did the Soviets even start a moon program? The origins really date back to JFK's speech in 1961, when Kennedy announces a goal of landing a human on the moon before the end of the decade. And so the Soviet response, one might, speculate, what do they think of this? Well, I've talked to a lot of people, I've looked through the documents. It turns out not much. They sort of heard this speech. They thought, well, it's just another speech. Part of the reason for their skepticism that anything was going to happen was that the Soviets were in a very assertive position of supremacy in space. They had just launched Gagarin. They had a whole bunch of other firsts. And the United States was seen as in a weaker position. So in the early 60s, the Soviet, I'd say 62, 61, 62, 63, the Soviets were not paying that much attention to what was then coalescing as the Apollo program, as most of you know. But they do fund a couple of things. In the early 60s, they start to develop, do we need some sort of super heavy lift rockets? And they approve a project called the N1 in September 1962. It's not clear what it's going to be for at that point. N for Nositelь, the Russian word for carrier. It's kind of pushed through by Korolev. Again, the primary goals are rather vague. There's some idea that they want to launch crewed missions to Mars, which seems incredibly ambitious in the early 60s. And they actually sort of draw up some designs, one of which I show you here. It's called the TMK-1. But there's some other military goals too. It's not, again, it's rather vague. They almost, want to develop the rocket and define its utility later on. But things suddenly change around 1963 because back in the USA, by the end of 1963, there's been 4 launches of the Saturn I booster. The Apollo CSM LEM contracts have been handed out. Lunar orbit rendezvous as the mode for the moon mission has already been nailed down. And all this news is going to Russia, basically. And at that point, Korolev, and there's letters and things like that, which I've seen around, let's say, September, October 1963, he starts to prioritize a moon landing as the thing to do instead of sort of vague plans. And he organizes a team, puts them to task, like, what can we do? And then there's more news from the US in May 1964, which was the first mock-up of a command service module, which was launched on a Saturn I. And that, for whatever reason, that launch really shook a lot of people. And there's reports I've seen of that launch that go all the way to Korolev's desk. And he's like, oh, they're really serious about this. And that sort of spurs him to arrange a meeting with the Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev. And I looked through all the guest books and all sorts of records in Moscow, looking for the date. And on the lower left-hand corner, this is the guest book. His name is listed, Sergei Korolev, on 17th July 1964. And that's when he meets Khrushchev and extracts a commitment for a moon landing. He says, we have to do this because the Americans are doing this. And I think we have a sporting chance to beat them. He mobilizes a coalition of supporters, a bunch of other influential people. Everybody agrees on the goal. Okay, we're going to do this, but they don't agree on who gets which part of it, and that's really the crux of the problem here. But nevertheless, on August, this should be, oops, there's a typo here. August 3rd, 1964, the Soviet Union issues. It's a secret document, but we have it now. It's been declassified. A national commitment, and that's what they essentially call it: a national commitment to a human lunar landing to beat the U.S. So that's 1964. And that's when sort of things start to mobilize. Really, the whole apparatus of the state begins to, pose a challenge to Apollo, if you will. So that's 3 years after Kennedy's speech. So the architecture of the moon program, what does it look like? Well, so let me just see. Immediately, they split the program into two. There's one project called an L1 circumlunar project, whose deadline is 1967, and then there's the landing, which is 1969. And these deadlines are very fungible and they change constantly. So it depends on what document you're looking at. But generally speaking, they sort of split into different launch vehicles and spacecraft for two projects that you would think would be sort of this part of the same project. Like, okay, you do circumlunar first, then maybe you do lunar orbits, then maybe you do a landing. But for some reason, they split it apart. And so that question naturally occurs, why two different programs? And the answer is essentially personality driven, because they wanted a piece of the pie and they didn't want the other person to participate in it. But also, there's no lack of unified coordinating bodies such as NASA. And I'll get back to this point later when I conclude the talk. What does that mean? There's no kind of official space agency like NASA. And in other versions of the talk that I've given here, I go into that question why there isn't and what did exist, because they have a very convoluted set of controlling mechanisms for the space program. In any case, Korolev got the lunar landing project. And then for about a year, Korolev and Chalamet fought over the circumlunar project. In other words, even though the commitment has been made, the national commitment, they couldn't agree on who would get to do it. And eventually Korolev, gathered a whole bunch of supporters and kind of ousted Chalamet from the whole thing. This is despite the fact that Chalamet, and I'm showing you a picture, had built considerable ground equipment, designed the spaceship for his circumlunar project, and was kind of gearing closer to flight testing. Despite all of that, he had to cancel the project, and Korolev takes over the kind of prime contractor by the end of 1965. And so Chalamet at that point is reduced to a subcontractor role. The moral, or not the moral, I guess, the kind of the essence of the story here is that there were many cases in the Soviet space program in the 1960s where they started a project and then somebody else comes up and says, I can do this better. And they start offering their own project, actually building hardware. So they're doing multiple things and they're wasting tons of money. And that, I'll get back to that later about how that essentially there's a kind of competition built into the project, but they don't know how to manage it properly. It's not as if once a decision is taken, all the other guys give up or do other things. They keep sort of competing even though the decision has been made. So that produces a lot of waste. In any case, at the end of all of this, Korolev has both projects under his control, the landing and the circumlunar project. And the circumlunar project, there's quite a bit of literature on it. It's called the L1, or in the public, the media, it's called the Zond program. It's basically a stripped down Soyuz, which is launched on a new rocket called the Proton. And there's just enough juice to send it around the moon, not enough to put it into lunar orbit. But it is quite an impressive stopgap kind of quick project. It's for about a week-long mission with 2 cosmonauts in this Soyuz. And that's what when I say stripped down Soyuz, I literally mean a stripped down Soyuz because the front orbital module is taken out and the 2 cosmonauts would spend a cramped week in the little descent module. And they soup up some of the propulsion stuff, guidance stuff, sensors and other things for this, which are quite different from the actual Soyuz. They also start training crews for this mission, and there's about a dozen cosmonauts who train. There's 6 core members who are sort of rotating to be on the prime crew. For the most part, we understand that the prime crew would be Alexei Leonov, here shown in this picture on the right, and Oleg Makarov, shown in the picture on the left. And the middle guy is Rukovishnikov, he's a backup. And he in some scenarios, he might have been the prime crew too. It's not clear, but basically we kind of have a sense that Leonov definitely would have been maybe on the first outbound mission. These guys trained from about 67 to 69 for this project, as I said, which is called the L1. The initial goal was to achieve circumlunar flight, which is a slingshot around the far side of the moon, by the 50th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, which of course happened in 1917, which was a big deal for the Soviet Union, a huge anniversary. But as it got closer to 67, there were a bunch of accidents. The Soyuz 1 accident killing Vladimir Komarov. They had to move the goalpost down a little bit to the end of 68. And that's the point at which it becomes a kind of real race with NASA, as you might guess. But the axiom among designers was, we'll only put a crew on board this spaceship if after 2 full robotic successes. So what ended up happening is that there were a bunch of failures, and all sorts of different things are starting to happen. And I just list the failures here. These are, when I say first stage, this is the launch vehicle, not the spacecraft. The spacecraft actually didn't have much of a chance to test itself out. But there's a bunch of failures through 67 and early 68. So they're getting a little anxious, like, are we going to be able to do this by the end of 68? Because in the summer, let's say July, it's clear that they haven't really had a success. And as you also probably know, in the summer, July, August, really, NASA begins to think about a lunar orbit mission for Apollo 8. And some of this news begins to seep out, assuming Apollo 7 is successful. So they're also feeling a little bit pressured. On the other side, in the United States, if you look at the media, of course, at the time, there's a lot of pressure here, thinking that the Russians are going to upstage Apollo. So it's kind of interesting how both sides were thinking about this. Here's some interesting images of their Zond L1 system. You can see the launch escape tower on the left-hand side, which would only be installed if there was a crew. And then on the right-hand picture, the stack with the Zond L1. These on the pad and a nighttime liftoff. I believe that's from April 68. So what ended up happening is that in September 68, we're moving into the fall now. They launched Zond 5, and it successfully flies around the moon. It has a little bit of a problem at re-entry, meaning that it's supposed to do a guided re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere to reduce G loads on the crew. It doesn't have a crew on board, of course, but they have a problem, and it goes into a ballistic re-entry and splashes down in the Indian Ocean. It is basically a success. There's a glitch in the re-entry, but a crew would have survived, so it's not necessarily a fatal glitch. So and they recover the spaceship, and it's essentially declared a success. So they need one more, and that's the issue now. And they have launch windows in November and December. So it's entirely possible, one could imagine, that they could get a crew out in December. And the crew begins to essentially get ready for this. As I said, Leonov and Makarov begin to prepare for this eventuality. Of course, what ends up happening, as we know, in November 68, they launch Zond 6, and it flies around the moon, and it actually has a guided reentry, so that's all good. But it has a catastrophic failure. There's failures on the outbound trajectory too, and becomes clear these are catastrophic failures. It depressurizes on re-entry, and then the parachute fails, so it basically crashes onto the ground, and the whole thing is destroyed. Inevitably, a crew would have been killed. And so the December 1968 launch is canceled, and there's some rumors and things like that that the cosmonauts went up to the Politburo and pleaded for the launch, but I found no evidence of it. It seems to be anecdotal. Either way, as we know, the early December 68 launch window for the Soviets passed, and in late December over Christmas, Apollo 8 flies to the moon triumphantly over Christmas 68. And that's it. And that's the sort of denouement, if you will, of the circumlunar flight. And I have here a diary entry from Nikolai Kamanin, who was this gentleman on the left, who was the coordinator of cosmonaut training, who's sitting here with Leonov, who might have commanded the first mission. And it's a little, diary entry, private, obviously secret entry. The flight of Apollo 8, this is written on December 21st. The flight of Apollo 8 to the moon is a world historical event. It is a celebration for all mankind. But for us, this holiday is darkened by the realization of missed opportunities and regret that now it is not Bykovsky, Popovich, or Leonov who are flying to the moon, but Borman, Lovell, and Anders. So I think that tells you that they were crushed in some substantive way by all this. So just move this. Okay. So that's the circumlunar project, and then they. So what's going on with the landing project? I don't want to get into too much of the statistics here, but it's basically a rocket, as I said, called the N1, and there's something called the L3 that's a huge stack that sits on top of it. And the rocket was progressively upgraded to the 1960s. I put English units on here, pounds and not kilograms, even though it seems weird to see pounds here, but just because that's what NASA used in the 60s. Or at least it was in the media. But in the red are figures for the Saturn V, and in black are figures for the N1. So you can see some comparison. The interesting thing to me, of course, is that the ground thrust of the N1 is quite larger than the Saturn V, but the payload to orbit is much lower, and this is because the Saturn V uses liquid hydrogen cryogenic engines on its upper stage. So, you can also see the number of engines on the first stage, 30 versus 5 F1s. But generally in the same class, maybe, but I suppose a bit inferior to the Saturn V, although they're very close in terms of their height, weirdly. The development of the N1 was deeply marred by all sorts of problems. I'm going to list them out very quickly. Problem number one was that Korolev wanted to actually use cryogenic propellants like liquid hydrogen and insisted upon them in many, 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 many letters, which are now available for us to see. But Glushko, the guy who was going to build those engines, refused, and there's a huge debate over all the reasons why. Glushko basically wanted to build engines that he could also have dual use for the military, and he understood that cryogenic engines with liquid hydrogen had no utility for ICBMs. So he didn't want to waste all his money or all his resources building these engines if he couldn't get dual contracts. So anyway, Korolev ends up collaborating with an inexperienced, because Glushko refuses, he has to go somewhere else. He gets this other guy, Nikolai Kuznetsov, to make the engines. Kuznetsov has a lot of trouble with the engines. In the midst of all this, of course, Glushko allied with Chelomey to develop an alternate moon landing rocket called the UR-700 in the late 60s, which also siphons off an enormous amount of resources and attention from the government. Problem number two was Korolev decided to skip static testing of the first stage, which is a fatal, I think, probably in my mind, the most fatal error. And why did he do this? Well, I mean, he understands, because every other rocket that he's ever developed, he's done this. So he skipped it for this because of limited resources and limited time. They were in a race. And so also the test sites that he did have available for, let's say, static testing, a huge stage like this, were diverted for military use and for Glushko's engines. And in fact, there's evidence to suggest that Glushko sort of passively tried to basically occupy all the testing stands so Korolev couldn't get his engines tested. Problem number three, as you can see at the base of the rocket, there's 30 engines, and they had a lot of difficulty synchronizing these engines to fire. They built a system called Chord. It was initially analog, controlled by an analog computer, and later goes into digital in the early 70s, but by that time it's too late for the project. But it is very difficult for them. And I know that, of course, SpaceX has these issues, are working through these issues in a very different environment now, 50, 60 years later. Problem 4, there's no unified commitment. As I said, the opposition from Glushko was huge. It's not inconsiderable. He also, as I said, was producing high performance rocket engines for a man I show here on Glushko's right. His name is Mikhail Yangel, who was all the ICBMs, most of the ICBMs produced during the Soviet era were produced under him. And Glushko basically got the contracts for those engines, for most of those engines. And in doing so, he threw many passive obstacles in front of the N1 project. The military wasn't interested in the N1, and the military is the primary customer of all of this stuff, in our entire space program. It's like the DoD essentially being the primary operator of their some sort of analog to the DoD in the Soviet Union. And so the military, and there's letters also from the military chief saying, why do we need this? Why do we even need to go to the moon? We need ICBMs, we need other things, we need tanks, airplanes, and so forth. So they're not really interested in this. And finally, problem, and this is all related, of course, insufficient funding because the military held the purse strings and they prioritized strategic parity. This is a classic picture of Glushko and Chelabay with a bunch of military marshals and commanders. Suggest, they were in alliance with the military. That's what their priority was. And so the N1 was a kind of lesser thing that they were working with. Some pretty pictures of hardware. This is their lunar orbiting ship that they wanted to use, to send cosmonauts to the moon. This is their lander called the LK. So this was the LOK and this was the LK. And you can see the size of their lander in relationship to the LEM. This is not my image, so I don't know, but who made it, but it is a nice, gives you a nice sense of the one cosmonaut in their lunar lander versus the 2 astronauts in the LEM. Also tells you something. The LEM has 2 stages. The LK of the Soviet LK has basically 1 stage. It's a 1-stage, single stage with 2 engines, a primary engine and a backup engine. And this is a mock-up of the LK with cosmonauts practicing. The overall technical approach was essentially defined by the limited mass possible to send to the moon. As I mentioned, the N1 couldn't get as much mass up as the Saturn V. So the LK was about 12,000 pounds. It meant that redundancy, meaning that if something doesn't work, you build a backup system that could be ensured by doubling the system because that adds more weight. So you have to go elsewhere to have redundancy. So you, for example, you reduce the 2 cosmonauts to a single cosmonaut. You get rid of a complicated docking system between the orbiter and the lander that can, it's basically, you go EVA outside. And even if you need a docking mechanism, because they need, and in the LOR scenario, they needed to dock, it's just a single use, it's like a bunch of honeycomb structures, and the docking node basically penetrates the honeycomb structure and gets stuck. And that's how they essentially did that. There's a hula hoop to help the cosmonaut raise up from the surface, so he would be wearing this during his surface stay. The landing operations were also, as I said, because they couldn't get enough weight, they were essentially determined by a bunch of questions, like what if our lander can't take off from the surface once it's down on the ground? Well, why don't we have a backup lander? We'll have to put it somewhere nearby so that the cosmonaut can walk to the backup one. Well, what if the backup lander is too far from our primary lander, which no longer works now? Well, then we'll have to have a rover on the ground to transport the cosmonaut to the backup rover. So these are the kinds of things they were sort of thinking through. What if the rover fails? How does the cosmonaut get to the backup lander? Well, we have a backup rover on the surface. We have 2 of them on the surface. And so the working through these problems essentially grew the program out to a really complicated set of operations. And Carla's organization had actually been developing a lunar rover called the E8 since the early 60s, and the E8-2 was the version that was adopted for, basically this cosmonaut would stand on a platform and just hold on to a railing, and the rover would be sort of moving between the 2 landers. And this rover, by the way, eventually called Lunokhod, which at the time we didn't know that the Lunokhod had anything to do with the Soviet crude landing project, but in fact, that's the main reason it exists at all. So the nominal landing, I'm going to actually, because of time, I'm going to kind of go through this really fast. There was, as I said, they launched a backup rover. They launched a primary rover. They eventually get down on the ground. One of the things that they do is, so they launched the backup lander and a backup rover, but the rover essentially circles around the lander to make and televises the condition of the lander to the ground. So the ground control wants to know if there's any external damage to the lander. So that's the other reason they're supposed to have very high quality cameras on the rover. And then a month later, they launched the crew. Once the backup stuff is set on the surface of the moon, they launched the actual crew with the primary lander. And so it's a basic LOR flight plan, much like Apollo, except the cosmonaut transfers from the lander to the orbiter via spacewalk. And then the primary lander descends to the surface, and that's it. And then the primary lander sets down near the first rover at the landing site. The rover checks out the external shape of the lander. And if everything's okay, the cosmonaut steps out onto the moon. And then if there's a problem with the primary lander, the cosmonaut just gets in the rover and goes to the backup thing. And so that's basically how they set up the whole problem. This is an artist's depiction of a cosmonaut near the lander with the rover in the background. And one of the questions I often get asked is who was going to be the first on the moon? And this question is, talked about a lot. In my research, I sort of discovered that it probably wasn't going to be Leonov, because Alexei Leonov is often touted as the first, if he might have been the first Soviet cosmonaut on the moon. More likely, it would have been a guy named Vladimir Shatalov. I actually spoke to Shatalov in 2012 and had a very lengthy conversation. And he was extremely senior and much more senior than Leonov and much more powerful. And he was flat out said Leonov would not have been the first, and he's just going around telling everybody. But he said he said that there's other people who were definitely in line, including myself. And Shatalov devised the exact program for piloting the lander down to the surface, and he showed me documents that of the programs that he developed. Eventually, when the program sort of began to die down, Shatalov moved to administration in 1971 and became the coordinator of their cosmonaut program, which is the sort of the Deke Slayton role. Let's see the time. So all of this, of course, never really happens because Sergei Korolev dies in 1966. The program is in complete disarray. There's Korolev in the top pictures, walking next to Igor Kurchatov, who is the so-called father of the Soviet atomic bomb. Korolev is succeeded by Vasily Mishin, who's shown in the bottom picture on the right. He's a brilliant manager, has actually developed many of the technical solutions on the N1, as well as the R7, but he's a terrible manager. He's supposedly a little bit of has a weakness for alcohol. Mishin directed the program for about 8 years after Korolev died. But under Mishin, the whole thing just sort of fell apart. And it's possible the whole thing would have fallen apart anyway, even if Korolev had lived, but certainly it happened under his watch. And in 1969, what they did was under Mishin, they said, it's clear we can't beat the United States to land a man on the moon, because it was clear by about December 68 that Apollo had all the pieces in play with the LEM and the various missions leading up to Apollo 9, 10, and 11. And they felt less and less confident that they would even be close. So they hatched a plan, which I call the many small successes plan, and to try to upstage any kind of Apollo moon landing, to take the edge off a potential moon landing. I put together this, I scoured through thousands of documents, and this is kind of what's jumping out at me, that this is what they were trying to do. What is the many small successes plan? This is the version from May 69, which I've seen, is basically this. Okay, so what do? In June or July, we launched a couple of robotic sample returners. We get moon soil back to the Earth before NASA. That's the first small success. And that could be kind of, I think, newsworthy globally, right? The report on the left is about the system the E85 system, which is their sample return project, which they're aggressively pushing. Then in early July, they launched their lunocod down to the surface of the moon. So that adds a little bit of extra excitement. Okay, we brought soil back, and now we have a working vehicle, a mobile vehicle on the surface of the moon. And then around a week later, they launched their Saturn V class N1 rocket. It's automated, there's no crew on board, but they do a complete lunar orbit mission. Again, very impressive. They put out pictures of their rocket. It's kind of newsworthy. And then finally, in late July, they launch a crew around the moon, circumlunar, and bring them back. So all of it together, sort of packaged, is not going to take the edge off Apollo in any kind of substantive way, of course. You know, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on the moon is pretty significant, but it does have to be sort of, people have to take notice of all this, like the Soviets are doing quite a lot. And so I think what it does is that this kind of activity would have, in my view, actually, in order to tell the story of Apollo 11, you would have to talk about all of this other stuff that's going on in the moon. And I think that's just what they wanted. They wanted to be part of the conversation with doing all these small successes. And so what ended up happening, you can guess what happened. A bunch of stuff failed. There was the big, so there was the big launch failure of the N1 on July 3rd, 1969, and destroyed one of the pads, photographed by the CIA and so forth. Huge explosion that was kept secret for many years. The sample returner was launched. Well, the first one was delayed and finally launched in July, and its radar wasn't working properly and it crashed into a mountain. And then the lunar rover wasn't launched at all, because that was also part of the plan, because they had some problems with the polonium power source. And then in August, they did launch the Zond a bit late, but they didn't have the confidence to put a crew on board at that point. And so it was a successful mission, but launched without a crew. So the many small successes plan just kind of petered out very quickly. And then the further N1 launches were basically unsuccessful. Although the November 1972 launch was almost up to second stage ignition. And I should mention that they considerably modified the rocket between 69 and 74. So by 74, it was, I wouldn't say it was a new rocket, but it was definitely a very upgraded rocket. As I said, with digital systems already being incorporated, brand new engines, all sorts of other things. But at that point, it was too little too late. And as most of us know, in 1974, Vasily Mishin was fired and put under gag order. You can't speak about this. And he was replaced at the design bureau by Valentin Glushko, Korolev's old rival. And Glushko's first act was to kill the N1 program. He said, this is, in fact, his documents were on the table. He destroyed all hardware. He destroyed a considerable amount of documentation. And he came to work with a new set of projects, which eventually became Energia and then Buran. The moon program was never really mentioned in official sources by the Soviet media until 1989. And there was a lot of denials, consistent denials. We were never in the moon race. We never did any of this. Although many Western observers guessed correctly that they were. And I should just have a shout out to some of these because my work builds on theirs. On the left, you see a picture that's Charles Sheldon on the left, Jim Oberg in the middle, and Charlie Vick on the right. Oberg in the middle was really, I think, one of the best people to do this. On the right-hand side of this slide, you see Russia Meant to Win the Moon Race by James E. Oberg from 1975. So he was already onto them very early in the game, even despite official denials that they had never done this. And it was only in 1989 that the official admission started to come in. There was a big interview with Vasily Mishin in which he was very irascible and kind of annoyed by this whole thing of having not to be able to speak about his life's work. And then I have to show this because once I wrote my book for NASA, Challenge to Apollo, I was able to get my book to Vasily Mishin in the summer of 2001, sometime before he passed away. So they were aware that there was a lot of interest in the West on what they were doing. I want to conclude with some maybe analytical issues. Why did the Soviets fail? People often ask me. There's no one reason, as with any kind of historical episode. There's, late start. That's definitely one. I think if they had really gotten their act together in 1961, sure, maybe it's possible. Lack of adequate funding. I tried to get the best estimates from their records, but my guess is about 12 billion on the moon program for over 12 years, which is in 1960s dollars. And as you know, Apollo was about 25 billion in a much more efficient economy. So with the United States. So I think you have to sort of compare those things. And inadequate funding and lack of ground testing. There's also lack of sufficient political commitment. And a lot of people are surprised to hear this. Well, why wouldn't they want to be first on the moon? And I think we have to put ourselves in the eyes of actual Soviet bureaucrats and military people in the 1960s. What do they really want? And what they really want is to be so militarily powerful that the United States cannot threaten them anymore. And so I think that's really the priority, the ICBMs and tanks and other things. So strategic parity is the issue. Poor management. There's no single management authority, and this comes to a larger issue that I often get asked about, and I talked about a challenge to Apollo. There's a kind of subtle irony to the fact that the United States had a single overarching authority, NASA, to manage the project, which is, sort of socialist in a way, whereas the Soviet Union had a cacophony of control mechanisms that is more sort of competitive in a way, which is, sort of capitalist. Those are very reductive categories, but there is something to that, I think, that works here, because control is distributed at so many levels. It's hard to even make sense. There's a lot of patronage, all sorts of internal conflicts, personalities can bubble up. As I said, you can push through some of your pet initiatives, even though the government isn't interested in it, just because of the force of your personality. And so there's a lot of waste. Basically, I think the way I put it is that there is a kind of competition set up in the Soviet space program. Okay, who's going to build the best design? But they don't know how to really manage competition, which is that when somebody actually wins, the other guy gives up in a more efficient system. But in that system, the other guy doesn't give up and keeps going. And that, I think, is the fundamental problem. And finally, penultimate is poor quality control. And finally, I would say that poor quality control, basically they might have the best engineers in the world, but if they can't build a precision instrument in a factory, it's not going to help you. And they had lots of problems in factories. And finally, automated systems, they really depended on robots and automated systems more than human intervention. And I think that cost them. So that's my sort of take on why they failed. And that's where I'll end. So thank you very much. And I'll stop here. I'll stop the share.
Okay, thank you very, very much, Asif. I'm always intrigued and enthralled with your talks. You could go on and on and on, and they're fascinating. And I'm sure I share that sentiment with others. We have some time for some questions. One question I'd like to ask, probably just as a follow-on to your last slide where you were talking about why reasons for failure. Have the former Soviet Union, have they learned since then? In other words, the lack of coordination, the competing design bureaus and so forth, because, as we look at what have they accomplished, say within the past 10 or 15 years or 20 years, have they really learned from these errors for these mega projects and moving forward, or are they still kind of stuck in the same mindset?
Yeah, that's a good question. But I think the problems they're dealing with now are very different. But, as you know, I think right after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they formed Roscosmos, like the government agency, which was essentially trying to emulate something like the European Space Agency, but more centralized. So I think actually they went kind of the other way, which is that they kind of nationalized everything in a weird way, which is like, even though they become officially capitalist, the Russian space program is actually kind of very centralized even now, although there are private corporations and people can hold, buy shares and those kinds of things, but it is very centralized. As far as the overall lessons, I don't think anything was really learned by them, because the personalities still very much drive what's going on in the Russian space program. They may not be as famous as Korolev or Glushko, but they're very personality-driven fiefdoms and things that operate, and I don't think that's changed very much.
One of the questions we have is our previous speaker, Justin Walsh, talked about Russian icons on the ISS. Was there any underground religion going on among Soviet astronauts or their support teams that you're aware of?
Wow, that's a good question. I know that some of you may have heard of this philosophy of cosmism, which is a kind of a philosophy in which it's called the philosophy of the common task. And basically, our task is to resurrect the dead from all our particles, which go out in outer space after we die. And believe it or not, there's a lot of people in current day Russian space program who subscribe to cosmist beliefs. Because officially cosmism was sort of not allowed under Soviet times. There may have been underground beliefs and so forth. That's harder to say, but I think definitely now cosmist beliefs about, and they tie into a more nationalistic, jingoistic Russian sensibility, which is that it's Russia's destiny to conquer the cosmos more than any other nation, and that's also part of it. And I think so. In order to really write about the Russian and the Soviet space program, I think we have to really account for that fact that for them, space was really a mission, a deeply embedded cultural mission. It's not just something that happened because of the Cold War. And I think that's what I've been trying to write about in the last books or so, about that cultural dimension, that all of this technical stuff doesn't really explain their utter single-mindedness about space. It's deeply, much in the way that, the American history people used to talk about the frontier and those kinds of things. I think in Russia, there's an analog to that's quite interesting to me.
I've got a question from Marcy Frumker. Do you think there was any consideration to trying to put a woman cosmonaut on the moon since the Soviets couldn't beat the US with a man?
It's also a great question, because it reminds me of what was it, that show For All Mankind? Did they put I think that was something that they did.
Right.
I may be mixing up seasons now, I at the time, and actually they disbanded the woman cosmonaut. They had 5 women who trained for various missions. Only one of them ever flew in space, but they disbanded that unit in 1969, around the time when the moon program was collapsing. I have seen, like, anecdotally, that they should be on one of the crews, but I don't think they were ever going to be the first one on the moon. It's in an alternate universe, it's possible they might have been. Now, if that would change, if NASA suddenly decided, that, oh, we're going to put a woman on Apollo 19, whatever that is. And so I think that might have changed their calculation, but not intrinsically. I don't think a woman would have been on a mission. Unfortunately, yeah.
Got a question. I think it's from Megan Pralinger. And she said, can you outline the trajectory to Soyuz from this point? I'm not quite sure what she meant by what point. Hang on, let's see, maybe she clarified it. Yeah, I'm not quite sure. If you could, I think I might be missing something. Do you understand? Maybe that's what I see here, but
well,
she might be asking.
Speculate. If what she means is how do we get to the current day Soyuz from all this?
Maybe that's it. Yeah, because that's currently still being used, and which is really amazing and continues to amaze people that they're using a spacecraft that's just extremely reliable over the years, and they continue to use it with very little modification.
Right. I mean, I think the design of this vehicle was what I call very robust. In other words, what they did was they designed it to be survivable for a lot of off-nominal situations. Like, the envelope of off-nominal situations that the Soyuz can survive is quite huge. And that's because when they designed this thing in the early 60s under Korolev, especially the descent module, which is like over-designed to survive anything. You might not be too comfortable, but you're going to survive it. And that was the whole point. And so, but yeah, the descent modules are very, the Soyuz basically is, I wouldn't say it's a copy or anything, but it has the same format as their lunar orbiter, and the same shape of the descent module was slightly differently shaped for the lunar orbiter because it's coming at lunar re-entry velocity, so it has to be shaped differently. But the same concept, which is that if for some reason they can't cushion the re-entry through skips and so forth, and it goes ballistic, the crew has to survive it, and so they designed it to make it completely survivable. But yeah, that's a very interesting part of the Soyuz, is that it's just a very robust design, and a very I think it's quite an elegant design in early 60s terms, that what they put together.
Is part of that robustness a byproduct of the huge capability, payload capability of their early rockets, and not so much they could basically include a lot of the robustness that might seem to be a little more simple in technology terms, but it's because they had this huge payload capability, so that they could kind of dumb down the technology that might gain them lighter weight vehicle.
Yeah, I think that's one one argument in a number of Soviet spacecraft, because they had more payload capability. They essentially designed this, but I don't know if that's true for the Soyuz descent module or the Soyuz in general. I think they were because I've seen a lot of the different options they were considering, but basically the Soyuz it's a design that, I mean, okay, you need a re-entry capsule, but you also need a space for the cosmonauts to just spend time in, but you can't. So they didn't want to, build a hatch in the re-entry capsule, so they built it in the forward module. So those kinds of decisions were made in 1960, 61. It's amazing to me that the Soyuz was designed in basically 61, 62, and it's still flying. So it's amazing.
This question's from Chris Gaynor. With multiple landings, backup lander rovers, the Soviets planned, had they given any thought to mascons? Even Apollo didn't get their landing on target until the second try.
That's true. They did, in fact, give a lot of thought to mascons. And in fact, the landers, the rovers, because the rovers were the first things down on the ground, the two rovers, they would have beacons essentially to guide the reserve and the primary lander down close to them. So that was their way of sort of compensating for all the unknown, mascons and other things that you might not be, basically have a homing radar or something like that that's connected to the target. But yeah, they did, in fact, because they were, although I think the original discovery of mascons was actually, there was a little fight about it in 1966 because the Soviets claimed that they might have done it, but it turned out they just missed it. But they had published something on mascons in 1966. So I think they were very well aware of those kinds of things.
I think we have time for one more question. And I think I'm going to ask one, if you don't mind. With all the recent attention on the Starship static test firing of their vehicle, I think yesterday, can you comment at all about the comparisons with that to N1? Indeed, you mentioned in there the fact that there wasn't static firing, which was one of the reasons why they had issues with that. Just to comment in general, because we have a launch vehicle with as many engines, if not more, than the N1.
I actually don't know how many engines Starship has, but a lot is the answer, I know. I think this is one of those concepts where the technology is finally caught up to the concept, because we have high-speed computing and all sorts of things now, which allow us to imagine 30, 40 engines and to be synchronized. In the 1960s, working especially with analog systems, it's unbelievable to imagine it. So I think, but I do think this is the historical lineage of the SpaceX work on Starship. It goes back to the N1, and I've actually had a recent inquiry from somebody at SpaceX asking me about the N1 and wanting to see my book because they were thinking about these engines. So I think that it's clear that there's a kind of lineage, but I do think the technology just wasn't there in the 60s. I'm not even sure it was there in the United States, just because high-speed computing and very large-scale integrated microchips and those kinds of things were just beginning to be introduced in the 70s. So I think now, of course, So I feel SpaceX has more grounds for confidence that they could do this as opposed to 50 years ago.
Okay, well, I think that'll we'll close. I want to thank you very
33.
much, Asif, for okay, 30, for joining us this morning. And I want to encourage everyone to come back this afternoon. We're going to take a lunch break for the next half hour or so, and then we'll be back at 1 o'clock with Chris Gaynor, who's going to talk about his work with the Hubble Space Telescope and its history. He has a new book that's been out fairly recently, so please join us again at 1 o'clock for that. And then we've got more speakers lined up after that as well. So we're not through yet, but thank you again so much, Asif, for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.